What's up, you guys? Welcome back to my channel. I cannot even begin to thank you enough for the amount of love and support that you guys left on my previous video and you have sent to the Ortiz family. If you did not watch my previous video, I strongly urge you to. This is not just one of my typical videos. The victim's family members, one of them is actually a longtime subscriber, so this person's one of us. And thankfully, this is not something that happens very frequently, but now that it has happened and I was able to cover it, thanks to all of you guys here on this platform giving me a chance to speak and raise awareness. We all need to make sure we rally behind this family and support them as much as possible. They have been so incredibly grateful for the coverage and for all of the support, and so I wanted to make sure that that message got relayed to you guys, because as much as I can sit here and ramble on and talk about these different cases, literally I am nothing without you guys here listening and helping and sharing and doing everything that you possibly can to help these families. Today we're actually digging into another solved case. I know, doing them back to back here, getting a little wild and crazy, but this one is on the Pizza Hut murders, which is known as Tucson, Arizona's most senseless and brutal triple homicide that happened back on January 17th, 1999. Now, this case is absolutely solved. Granted, to this day, no one has any idea why these two men did what they did. They gained absolutely nothing from these murders. But the big reason I wanted to cover it is because one of the perpetrators is supposed to be released in 2 years. 2024, I'm not exactly sure what month, he will be released back into the public. He's 40-something years old at this time. And that just doesn't sit well with me, and it shouldn't sit well with a lot of people. I honestly don't know if there's any way to stop it. I don't know if there's any way to at least have someone look into this and make sure this is the right decision. Let's just dive right into the details of the case. It was January 17th, 1999, and there were 3 individuals working at the Pizza Hut on Broadway and Pantana on the east side of Tucson. 44-year-old Robert Curry, who was the restaurant's manager, he was known as being incredibly positive all the time. He could see the good in any situation. He had a really wacky sense of humor, and he was also described as being very generous. Then there was Melissa, who went by Lisa Moniz, who was only 20 years old. She was described as being very warm-hearted, kind to everyone. She had a love for horses and had been working ever since she was 15 years old. And then finally, 17-year-old James Bloxam. He was the youngest of the group and had a lot of dreams. He loved animals and he wanted to be possibly a pilot or at least an airplane mechanic. 3 individuals who were important to someone whose lives were taken. The restaurant would typically close at around 10 p.m. and Melissa's boyfriend, Michael Orban, would usually come and pick her up at about 11 p.m. On this particular night, Melissa's boyfriend arrived in the parking lot of the Pizza Hut, and usually at that point, she's probably ready to get the heck out of there, but Melissa wasn't coming outside. After waiting a few minutes, he was already suspicious that something may be wrong, but when he started to look closer at the restaurant, he became even more worried when he realized that no one in the restaurant was moving around. There was no movement, no signs of anyone inside, absolutely nothing. So at this point, Michael Orban decided to go inside to check on everything. When he walked into the Pizza Hut to check and see where Melissa was, he stumbled across one of the most brutal scenes he could have ever imagined. Melissa was laying on the floor, covered in blood and spitting up blood, but obviously still alive. In a panic, he turned to run to the nearby Circle K gas station to try to call 911. At this point, he obviously was not sure if whoever was responsible for this was still inside of the Pizza Hut. As he turned, he immediately saw the bodies of James Bloxam and Robert Curry also on the ground. Both James and Robert were laying in pools of blood and clearly were no longer alive. At this point, he rushed over to the Circle K gas station and called 911 to report what he had just witnessed. Within minutes, an EMS arrived, and from my understanding, they didn't wait for police to arrive. They did not wait for the building to be cleared. They saw that Melissa was inside of the restaurant clinging to life and knew that they had to do something. So they immediately ran inside, loaded her up into the ambulance, and rushed her off to the hospital. At this point, they were able to see that both James and Robert were in fact no longer alive. Robert Curry had suffered 3 separate gunshot wounds, one to his head, one to his neck, and one to his chest, and they were able to tell that he likely died from bleeding out. That unfortunately meant that he could have been laying there for 25 to 30 minutes before ultimately passing away. James Bloxham also had multiple gunshot wounds to his head, his chest, his abdomen, his leg. Bullets had passed directly through his lungs and also through the center of his brain, so they believed that he likely died within just a few minutes. So at least he did not have to lay there suffering like Robert potentially did. Within minutes of the EMS arriving, Tucson police also arrived and started to process the Pizza Hut as a crime scene. They roped everything off. They reached out to the different family members that they could after identifying everyone, and they tried to figure out who on earth would have done this. Was this a robbery? What exactly is going on here? Right away, they noticed that one of the booths in the restaurant was still dirty, and it was the only one. There were still napkins, plates, there were cups still on the table, and this led authorities to believe that whatever happened either happened almost immediately after closing at 10 p.m., because at that point they would have cleaned everything up, and it also made it possible that the last customers in the restaurant may have been responsible for whatever had happened that night. Police found bullet fragments, whole bullets, and casings all over the restaurant. There were obviously some where the victims were found. There was one that was lodged into the gumball machine across the restaurant, some near the east entrance of the restaurant. One was on top of the cash register. So clearly something pretty huge happened here. And when an expert was brought onto the scene and was able to check the placement of everything, they were able to determine that whoever shot all of these individuals likely did it from the restroom of the restaurant, or at least somewhere in that general area. Unfortunately, within 2 hours of being rushed to the hospital, Melissa was announced dead, and authorities were no closer to answers. It didn't appear that large amounts of money had been taken, the safe hadn't been messed with, so the motive was really unknown until the following morning when police started to get answers. On the morning of January 18th, authorities received a phone call from a man named Josh Simmons, and this young man said that he had been with someone in the early morning hours that outright confessed to being involved in this triple homicide. And obviously, after hearing this shocking information, he immediately brought it to police. According to Josh, 17-year-old Hurstel said that he and 19-year-old Tom Pressertpong had been at the Pizza Hut the night before, just before closing. He said that they originally had wanted to rob the Pizza Hut for some reason, but said that instead they just decided to apparently murder everyone inside the building. He bragged that he himself first shot Melissa in the neck before moving towards the back of the restaurant. He said that when he came back to the front of the restaurant, he witnessed Pressertpong with his hands around Melissa's neck because clearly she was still alive, and he claims that Pressertpong was trying to snap her neck in an attempt to fully kill her. He seemed proud of what he had done. He didn't really say why he did it. He also didn't specifically mention murdering Robert Curry or James Bloxham, but this was obviously enough information for authorities to want to find both individuals and arrest them. Luckily, Josh said he knew exactly where they both were and led authorities straight to them. Police ended up finding both of the men standing beside Pressertpong's truck, and they both were arrested. Apparently, there was no issue with this. They didn't fight or anything. I'm sure they knew it was coming because they decided to immediately afterwards run their mouth. Both were brought in and put into interrogation rooms where both of them were questioned by Detective Charlton and Olivas, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing that one name correct. Hurstel was the very first to be questioned, which is understandable because he was the one who immediately within hours went to run his mouth as if this was something that he was proud of. Authorities asked him if he was involved in this crime, and he very adamantly denied being involved whatsoever, and also denied ever being at the Pizza Hut the night before. So because they were getting absolutely nowhere with Hurstel, they decided to go and speak to Pressertpong. Pressertpong was from Thailand. He immigrated here about 11 years prior to this arrest, so they did have to speak to him and make sure he didn't want to reach out to his consulate for advice, things like that. But once they did this and he agreed to speak to them, he just word vomited everything out, confessed to absolutely everything. According to Pressertpong, he and Hurstel decided to go and eat at the Pizza Hut. He drove them both there in his 1995 Nissan truck, and he let authorities know that he always kept his Glock on him. His .22 was always kept safely in his truck. He said they went inside the restaurant and began to eat, and while eating, casual conversation, they brought up the idea of, hey, why don't we rob this place? According to a few different sources that I've seen, Prasert Pong didn't think that he had his debit card on him. So I don't know if they decided to bring this conversation up because they weren't sure how they were going to pay for their meal. I don't know why in that case they didn't just decide to dine and dash and instead thought they would just rob the place, and then somehow that trickled into not taking any money and murdering people. But either way, apparently Prasert Pong decided against this sometime throughout the meal. He said that there was a female in the restaurant and that he also ended up finding his debit cards. Prasert Pong stated, however, that during his conversation with Hurstel told him that when they had gotten out of the truck, he brought Prasert Pong's gun with him. When the meal was done, Prasert Pong went up to the counter to pay for their meal. Hurstel went off to the restroom, and Prasert Pong says as the receipt was printing out for their meal, all of a sudden, Hurstel rushes out of the bathroom and, quote, goes crazy with the gun. Prasert Pong stated that Melissa was the very first to be shot, and then immediately Hurstel turned his sights onto Robert Curry, the manager of the restaurant. Robert was repeatedly asking Hurstel, what do you want? Like, what do you want? Like, don't hurt us. Let us just get you what you want. So Hurstel asked him, where is the safe? But before Robert could even get anything out, Hurstel immediately shot him 3 times. Robert fell to the ground, so did the deposit bag that he had in his hand, and at this point, James was trying to run and save himself out of the back of the restaurant, but unfortunately, Hurstel got to him before he was able to as well. Prasert Pong said at this point, he did in fact see that Melissa was still alive, and he decided to go and try to break her neck. At this point, I don't know if he was just really panicked. From his version of events, it seems like, yeah, he maybe thought because he believed they couldn't pay, they should rob the place and run, which still makes absolutely no rational sense. I'm sure that murder never really even crossed his mind based, again, on his story, and this is just on my speculation. But he almost possibly felt thrown into the middle of it and panicked and said, oh no, she'll be able to identify us. I have to do something about this. So he then went on to snap her neck. However, in the same breath, that is something that is incredibly personal and difficult to do. Like, that would not be someone's first instinct, in my opinion, unless there is just something really off there. After this, he went and grabbed the debit card machine, again, seemingly in an attempt to hide his identity since he had in fact just paid. And he also grabbed the deposit bag that was laying beside Robert, and they sped off in his truck. First thing they did was try to destroy and get rid of the debit card machine. They threw it into a wash, and then they also decided to go and burn the bank bag because when they opened it up, it was not cash. It was only checks. I'm assuming they only grabbed it to begin with just because it happened to be there. I don't think they looked through the cash register or anything. This all just seems like one giant unplanned chaotic mess. After getting rid of the debit card machine and the bank bag, Prasert Pong decided to try to also kind of conceal everything else possibly linking him to the crime, which is essentially all of it because he paid for the meal, his truck drove them there, his gun shot all these people. So he took his gun, he took the extra magazines, he took his ID cards, his debit card, everything, and tucked it up into the wheel well of the spare tire underneath his truck. From there, they went to a place called Aaron Billiards, which in my opinion is possibly them trying to create some sort of alibi, saying that they were there. There's no way they could have been at the Pizza Hut. And Prasert Pong again tried to cover his tracks by immediately calling police once they got there and falsely claiming that his truck had been broken into while he was at Aaron Billiards and all of his belongings had been stolen out of there. From there, they then went to the house where Josh Simmons was staying. There was Josh and another friend at the home at the time. They were both asleep. Again, I think this was possibly Hurstel and Prasert Pong trying to extend their alibi. And at some point during that morning, he ended up telling Josh Simmons that he was a part in the Pizza Hut murders. Now, using this overflow of information from Prasert Pong that I don't think they were really expecting to get, they took the recording from the interview and went right back to Hurstel. They were hoping that if they let Hurstel know, look, your friend has cracked. We already know that you played a part in this, that maybe he would then go on to confess. And thankfully, that is exactly what happened. Once little clips were played for him where Pastor Pong was telling the truth, even incriminating himself, he finally confessed to playing a part in the triple homicide the night before. This case gathered so much publicity because there was absolutely no reason as to why these two young men, 17 and 19 years old, and Christopher Bo Herschel was still in high school at the time. I think he was actually still a junior. It was just hard for everyone to wrap their heads around why these two young men did this. They didn't really get anything from it, monetary-wise. They didn't even try really hard to steal anything while they were there. It was just murdering for the fun of it, and that's horrifying. It also started a bunch of conversations about safety in the workplace and how this could have possibly been prevented, the different measures that companies could take in order to prevent things like this from happening ever again. On top of that, the east side of Tucson at the time was a place where everyone felt safe. There was not a high crime rate. Families were raised there. It was a good location to be. Everything about this entire murder just seemed so contradictory to what you would expect all of the facts to be. It was decided that Christopher Bo Herschel would be tried as an adult, and it was also decided that there would be a dual jury trial, and they would be tried together. There were a lot of pushes against this to try to have them tried separately, but because of how complicated it gets when you have confessions where people are, implicating each other, that prevents certain bits of evidence that are really honestly necessary from being introduced into another's trial. They figured this was the best way to do it. So you don't normally see a dual jury. It's not incredibly common, but it's where you try two individuals together and they each have their own jury. So the juries are completely separate. They make their own separate decisions, but all of the information is introduced at one time. And it's honestly very interesting in my opinion. Because there was so much publicity in the case, it was decided that it would be moved to Prescott, Arizona, and the trial started on August 24th, 2000. Now, before I get into what exactly happened at the trial, I do want to kind of say a huge shout out to Pizza Hut corporate because they did everything they could to try to ensure that they helped these victims' families, and they ended up sending a public relations officer out so that the public relations officer could answer questions that anybody had and deal with the media so that the owner of that particular Pizza Hut could sit down and really think about their restaurant, reach out to the families. Sergeant Russ Charlton, who was obviously involved in the case at the time, even offered to go with the owner of the Pizza Hut to speak to the families. The owner of the Pizza Hut wanted to personally apologize to everyone and offer his condolences. It just felt like one giant support system. So Pizza Hut corporate, is handling all of the media and the chaos, and the owner is able to focus on the families, and the sergeant's there to back him up and support everyone. And honestly, I just really wish this is what we saw in every single case that we looked into. Moving back to the trial, I don't know if they did any DNA testing on the gun itself. I know that they did in fact find it in Pastor Pong's car. I do know that they did DNA testing on all of those items left behind in the restaurant booth and were able to DNA match all of those things to both Herschel and Pastor Pong, so that put them at the scene of the crime and also showed that Herschel was not honest because he said he never even went to the Pizza Hut. Honestly, I don't know why I expected it to go differently, but essentially they both pointed the finger at each other. I find that kind of interesting because Herschel denied everything from the start and Pastor Pong decided to confess, where he very clearly implicated himself. So I feel like maybe after Herschel found that out, that Pastor Pong had given everything up and pointed the finger at him, Herschel maybe decided he could in turn point the finger at Pastor Pong to try to get the heat off of himself. I don't know. Both men were being charged with first-degree murder, and from my understanding, Pastor Pong, because he took multiple things throughout the restaurant, was also being charged with armed robbery. I don't believe Herschel was charged with armed robbery, but I wasn't able to find enough information to confirm that or not. During the trial, Pastor Pong, from my understanding, stuck to pretty much exactly what he had already told police when he was being interrogated, that Herschel was the one who shot all three individuals, but that he had attempted to murder Melissa. But Herschel, on the other hand, claimed that he was actually the one who heard the gunshots go off, that he was in the bathroom minding his business, and all of a sudden the gun goes crazy and he comes out and Prastert-Pong has killed all three individuals, and he saw Prastert-Pong with his hands around Melissa's neck. Honestly, again, I don't know how believable Hurstel's story is because it completely contradicts what he told Josh Simmons. Granted, he never confessed to murdering James or Robert when he spoke to Josh, but he specifically stated that he shot Melissa. But regardless, both men were found guilty. They were convicted, and then they were sentenced to the death penalty in the murders of Melissa and Jason. However, when it comes to Robert Curry, from interviews that I have seen with Robert Curry's wife and his sister, they did not want the death penalty when it came to his particular murder. They said that 3 individuals losing their life was enough, and that Robert was not that kind of person. He was always so positive. He never, ever would have wanted them to try to go for the death penalty for his own murder. So they both ended up getting, on top of their death sentence, life without parole in Curry's death. Prastert-Pong also ended up being sentenced on top of his death penalty and life sentence without parole to 3 concurrent terms of 21 years in prison for his 3 armed robbery convictions. So Prastert-Pong really has the charges laying on him, and Hurstel obviously has the death penalty and the life sentence, but that's about it. However, by 2003, both men's convictions and sentences were overturned. Some way or another, the cases ended up in the Supreme Court, and it was suggested that the judge may have coerced the jurors to kind of settle on the death penalty. And after investigating everything, they ruled that the jurors should impose the death penalty and not a judge, which they said is exactly what actually did happen. The prosecution was not going to just let these men get away free, so they both were charged again and headed for a second trial. I don't know in the second trial if they did another dual jury or if they were both tried together, but I do know that Hurstel's trial began October of 2005, and he ended up being found not guilty on 3 counts of first-degree murder, and the jury deadlocked on second-degree murder. And this blew everybody's mind, especially the families. The families of the victims were distraught. They could not understand how the jury came to this decision because, according to them, 4 times during the trial, they heard Hurstel confess from his own mouth 4 times. And because they were deadlocked, this meant Hurstel was going to a 3rd trial. Now, I do believe Prastert-Pong only had 2 trials, and in the second one, he did end up being found guilty of first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison. He did try to fight this conviction and sentencing again. Apparently, he claimed there was a violation of his 4th Amendment, and he said this was because of warrantless searches of his truck. When he was arrested the morning of January 18th with Hurstel, the police department noticed that one of the back windows of his truck did not lock. So they did not feel the truck was secure enough to leave it on the side of the road with possible evidence inside of it. So they had it towed to the police department and put it in their lot. However, once they got there, they also were really concerned that it was not secure enough because it was kind of a main thoroughfare where people would go in and out, which meant anyone coming to the police station would have access to this truck. So Detective Wright, who was someone looking into the case, decided at this point to search the vehicle herself. She searched the cab of the truck, she searched the engine compartment under the cover of the bed of the truck, and she did all of this without a warrant, but she ultimately found absolutely nothing. But once Prastert-Pong told authorities exactly where the murder weapon was and his IDs and all of that, Detective Wright went out to the truck again, still without a warrant, and collected all of the evidence. There was a plastic bag in the wheel well containing a holster. There was obviously the Glock that they used, gun magazine, a pair of gloves, all of Prastert-Pong's IDs. But he said since this was all gathered without a warrant, that it was a violation. However, this did not end up working in his favor. The court agreed basically that the search was in fact unreasonable, the first one. However, when she did this first unreasonable search, nothing came of it. Because of that, there was nothing to suppress from the trial, so pretty much this was dismissed. And then in the second search, While there was in fact not a warrant, Prasert-Pong essentially waived his privacy rights when he told police exactly where this murder weapon was. They said that this also fell under inevitable discovery because police had already arrested them. They already had a confession at that point. They already had the location of the gun. If they got a warrant, which was exactly what would have happened and the process that they were following, they would have ultimately found it. So all of this ended up being denied. He also tried a handful of times to say that his statement to police was involuntary. He claimed that police had either promised him something or that they threatened him, and so essentially he just said what he had to. He was hoping that by pushing this angle that his audio taped confession would essentially be thrown out, but ultimately they said, look, you came in here, you very clearly willingly gave the statement, so that was also just pushed to the side entirely. At this point, Hurstel went on to his third murder trial, which, just for a second, stop and think about what that felt like for the families, the victims' families, having to go through this over and over and over and over again. And according to at least the families that have spoken publicly, Prasert-Pong, while obviously being very well involved in this, he was remorseful. He apologized to the victims' families, and Robert Curry's sister has publicly stated that she has forgiven him. However, Hurstel has not once shown any bit of remorse, does not seem to care about his actions. Some pictures that I've seen of him, he almost has this smirk on his face. He seems almost satisfied with what he has done. And it became even harder when they realized that the only way to ensure that he served any time was by doing a plea deal. They were worried that, he wasn't found guilty for first-degree murder in his second trial. They deadlocked at second-degree murder. So at this point, they're just trying for second-degree murder. But they were worried it would either deadlock again or he would just be found not guilty and walk away. And in my opinion, out of the both of these men, Hurstel is the one that scares me the most. So they decided to offer him a plea deal. If he pled guilty to second-degree murder, he would be given a 25-year sentence, and then that was it. And he'd already served 8 of those years while dealing with all of these trials. He ended up taking the plea deal, and he will be released in 2 years. At that point, he was sent off back to prison. There were no more trials in his future, but again, the law kind of laid on to Prasert-Pong. In 2006, Superior Court Judge Frank Dolly stated that after listening to the facts in the case and listening to the victims' family members, amongst other things, he didn't believe that Prasert-Pong ever deserved a chance at parole. So while parole may have been a possibility at first, it was decided then and there that they were going to take that away from him, that what he did was senseless and brutal, and that he was not going to be put back into the public to potentially reoffend. Upon hearing this information, Prasert-Pong freaked out. He said this was absolutely unfair. He started attacking his attorney verbally, saying he didn't do a good job defending him, that he was a horrible attorney. He also started to defend himself and his actions that night by saying that he only was there because he was craving hot wings. He also said, quote, "For the record, I'm not the shooter, nor did I have a gun on me. My intention was to eat, pay, and leave." But all of his remarks did him absolutely no good, and he was also just sent back to prison where he will be for the rest of his life. The Pizza Hut itself ended up being torn down. The owner was kind of faced with a decision. He received over 100 letters in the mail, half of them saying, you have to keep the restaurant open, don't let these people win. The other half saying that the only right thing to do to honor the victims would be to not have the Pizza Hut there anymore. He did state that he was already planning on moving locations once the lease was up, but now that this has happened, he just could not be in that building anymore. So he did ultimately move his business somewhere else, and then that building itself was removed and replaced with something else. According to Russ Charlton, who was the sergeant at the time, he has since been interviewed in the past few years and said that Hurstel has just meshed in real well with prison life. He doesn't seem like he's having a bad time whatsoever. He's like kicking it in prison. He says that he strongly believes, based on the way Hurstel went about this entire situation, the way that he reacted during all of the trials, the way that he has just so flawlessly blended into prison inmates, that immediately once he is released, he is likely going to reoffend. And that scares me and should scare everybody else in the area. And the part that makes me that much more upset upset is the fact that these victims' family members still live in the area, at least a handful of them. They drive by the location where Robert, Jason, and Melissa were all senselessly and brutally murdered. I'm genuinely concerned that this man is going to be in the same vicinity as them. Imagine going through what they've gone through, knowing the things that this man has participated in and done, and then seeing him out on the street. As I said, I don't know what can be done about this, but I just could not sit back and know this information and not say anything about it. It has also been pointed out by Russ Charlton, quote, just in my opinion, the heinousness of it. It was so senseless, the whole circumstance, the so-called reason for it happening. It would have been so easy to rob the Pizza Hut and make off without harming anyone, but for some reason, they really wanted to push things further. I'm hoping for all of the family's sake that Hurstel is different, has decided to lead a better lifestyle. He was 17 years old at the time. He was not even an adult, but I just don't know how likely that's going to be. Robert's sister did say something in her interview, actually quite a few things though, that stuck out to me like no other. She said that in a trial, everything is about the accused, and the victims just become a piece of evidence, and that is it. Once these victims are gone and can't speak for themselves, even in their trials, it's like there's no one there to remind you that they were living, breathing human beings that other people cared for. They are just a number, just evidence. And I had really never looked at it that way. And it took me like 30 minutes of just sitting and staring at my wall with a stabbing pain in my heart for every single family that has ever had to sit through a trial and feel like everything in the trial refers to their loved one as just a piece of evidence. I felt like this week was a great week to have this conversation as well, because I don't know about you, but I am very closely following what's happening in New York with Harvey Marcellin, and I feel like this is just a prime example of what can happen when someone is released from prison when either A, they need to be in a mental facility receiving some sort of treatment and not in prison, or they're just released from prison when they really shouldn't be. For those of you that are not aware of what's happening in New York, or you don't know what I'm talking about, an 86-year-old woman named Harvey Marcellin is currently facing second-degree murder charges, evidence tampering, and concealing a dead body in connection with the death of 68-year-old Susan Layden from Brooklyn. And this is not the first time she has done this. 2 separate times, Harvey Marcellin has been charged with murder in connection to girlfriends that she has brutally killed and dismembered. I think she served 20 years for the first girlfriend, and then I cannot remember how many years for the second one that she killed and dismembered, which by the way she did while on parole, and then somehow was released again, and now at 86 years old, she is still out here killing people, you guys. There's footage capturing Marcellin get up from a wheelchair with her victim's leg underneath of it. Sitting here and watching someone that either A, should never have been released from prison, or B, should have received psychiatric help instead of being put in prison, somehow be released 2 separate times and murder 3 different people is mind-blowing to me. And it just really got me thinking about this case and the fact that police have adamantly and repeatedly said that they strongly believe Hurstel will reoffend. So let me know what you think down in the comments below. Again, please leave some kind words to the victims' families down below. Be respectful in the comment section. Now, on an entirely unrelated note, before I go, I want to let you guys know that my Facebook page is up and active and running. I've had a Facebook page for years. I have not kept up with it. I have not kept up with my Twitter. I rarely keep up with my Instagram. I like to be outside, and that's about it. My phone is lost like 90% of the time. My Facebook page is officially up and running, and I'm very active on there. But what is really cool is that there are shortened versions of my videos that are slowly starting to be released there so that you can either A, brush up on a case that you don't fully remember what happened in like 15 minutes instead of listening to me ramble for hours. You can also share these little snippets of my videos much easier through social media, at least on Facebook, which is a really awesome way to help spread awareness. But that's all that I have for you guys today. Definitely go check out my Facebook page. It'll be linked down below. Give it a follow. Check out the shortened versions of my videos. Share them to help raise awareness. If you haven't already, go ahead and hit the subscribe button down below to become a part of the Howlin' fam so that we can hopefully bring them home together. And I will see you guys in my next video.